Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This channel is for the purposes of turning you on to great theories of everything that you probably haven't heard of before because they're obscure, mostly done by so-called crackpots who spent their whole life toiling in obscurity over something that they never were recognized for, but for the sake of principle, they hit a home run anyway, and their works are in jeopardy to be tossed onto the scrap heap of history. And so this channel is attempting to make sure that that does not happen, or to ensure that that does not happen. And we also try to help to enable you to use these things in your own life in order to round out your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, and for freedom and sovereignty. Today is our 18th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And I'm getting a little bit of mail about this. And I guess nobody is really watching the video, but they look at the title and they say, no, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not a deception. And that's not what I'm saying. And that's not what the book is saying. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not, I don't think, a deception, although I wouldn't rule it out 100%. But the method of getting them out to the public was a deception, to enable their use by scholars in the field. That was a deception. And we are on Chapter 8, about to finish Chapter 8 on the the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in some caves 20 miles outside of Jerusalem, and they turned out that there are a lot of different documents, 800 different documents, I think, including every one of the books of the Old Testament, except for Esther. Apparently, interestingly, I think Esther was the last one of the books of the Old Testament to have been written. And so it's possible that these writings actually came out before Esther did. But I'm not going to, put any money on that. That's just what I've heard. And, but anyway, even though they're mostly Old Testament texts, there's a lot of sectarian material related specifically to the sect of people who lived in these, in this desert here. Qumran is what it was called. And it seems pretty clear from looking at the language and the mannerisms and the characters named and the place names that these people were either the same as or very, very close to the same people who wrote the Gospels. And so even though these are Jews who are Old Testament worshipers or readers, at least, they the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls are of ultimate meaning to Christianity. And this chapter was called the Challenge to Orthodox Christianity. And I think we just have the last paragraph or two. To an agnostic historian or even to an undogmatic Christian, such a discovery would have been exciting indeed. It probably would have been with a certain sacred awe that one handled documents actually dating from the days when Jesus and his followers walked the sands of ancient Palestine, trudging between Galilee and Judea. One would undoubtedly, and with something of a frisson, have felt closer to Jesus himself. The sketchy details of Jesus' drama and milieu would have been broken free from the print to which they had been confined for 20 centuries, would have assumed density, texture, solidity. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not like a modern book expounding a controversial thesis. They would comprise first-hand evidence, buttressed by the sturdy struts of 20th century science and scholarship. Even for a non-believer, however, some question of moral responsibility would have arisen. Whatever his own skepticism, could he, casually and at a single stroke, undermine the faith to which millions clung for solace and consolation? For DeVoe, now DeVoe was the original leader of what they called the international team, which is these team of scholars, so-called, mostly were Dominican priests, Catholic priests, who were assigned to collate, catalog, translate, and disseminate this information. They were discovered in caves between 1947 and 56 or so, and this international team formed about 56, I think. And, you know, for 35 years, they pretty much kicked the can down the road and never published anything of value. A few books here or there, but nothing really of value. And they apparently saw something that they didn't like when they were going over the stuff, and they decided to just sequester it. So for DeVoe, the leader of the international team, and his colleagues working as representatives of the Roman Catholic Church, it must have seemed as though they were handling the spiritual and religious equivalent of dynamite, something that might just conceivably demolish the entire edifice of Western teaching and belief. Okay, now this is chapter 9. It's called the Scrolls. It is not feasible or relevant in this book to list all the texts known to have been found at Qumran or even to have been translated and published. Many of them are of interest solely to specialists. Many of them consist of nothing more than small fragments whose context and significance cannot now be reconstructed. A substantial number of them are commentaries on various books of the Old Testament, as well as on other Judaic works known as Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha. A pseudepigrapha is, if I'm saying that right, is a book that claims to have been written by someone way back when, but wasn't. Is written by someone else and more close to the present, I think. And then Apocrypha, I think, are just the books that didn't make the cut of whoever it was decided to cut the books of the Jewish Old Testament into a canon. Like, these make the cut, these don't. You know, so we'll never hear about these other ones, but these here are important. And, you know, it's interesting to note that, like, say, for example, in the 4th century, even as late as the 4th century, the book of Acts wasn't really accepted as being legitimate. But now, you would never know that now. You know, the book of Acts was a sketchy kind of book in the 4th century. But nowadays, it's you know, seen as being one of the most important books of the New Testament. Okay. Okay, this section is called the Copper Scroll. Found in the Qumran cave designated number 3. There were about 14 caves, I believe, that they eventually found books in. And they're all in these jars that are were custom made for the purpose of storing these books. And there apparently are no jars like this on Earth. They're like completely unique kind of jars. Okay, found in the Qumran cave designated number 3. The copper scroll simply lists in the dry fashion of an inventory 64 sites where a treasure of gold, silver, and precious religious vessels is alleged to have been hidden. Many of the sites are in Jerusalem proper, some of them under or adjacent to the temple. Others are in the surrounding countryside, perhaps as far afield as Qumran itself. If the figures in the scroll are accurate, the total weight of the various scattered caches amounts to 65 tons of silver and 26 tons of gold, which would be worth some 30 million pounds at today's prices. This was written in 1991. I think, well, you know, a ton of gold is something like $60 million. So 26 tons of gold is already almost $2 million, 1.6 plus billion dollars. So it's probably worth checking it out if you happen to be in the neighborhood. As such things go, a sunken Spanish treasure galleon, for example, would fetch far more. But not many people would turn their noses up at it, and the religious and symbolic import of such a treasure would place it, of course, beyond all monetary value. Although this was not publicized when the contents of the scroll were originally revealed, the text clearly establishes that the treasure derived from the temple, whence it was removed and secreted, presumably to protect it from the invading Romans. One can therefore conclude that the copper scroll dates from the time of the Roman invasion in AD 68. As we have noted, certain members of the international team, such as Professor Scrolls and the former Father Malik, deemed the treasure to be wholly fictitious. Most independent scholars now concur, however, that it did exist. Nevertheless, the depositories have proved impossible to find. The directions, sites, and landmarks involved are indicated by local names long since lost, and the general configuration and layout of the area has, in the course of 2,000 years and endless wars, changed beyond all recognition. In 1988, however, a discovery was made just to the north of the cave in which the copper scroll was found. Here, in another cave, 3 feet or so below the present surface, a small jug was exhumed, dating from the time of Herod and his immediate successors. The jug had clearly been regarded as very valuable and had been concealed with extreme care, wrapped in a protective cover of palm leaves. It proved to contain a thick red oil, which, according to chemical analysis, is unlike any oil known today. This oil is generally believed to be balsam oil, a precious commodity reported to have been produced nearby at Jericho and traditionally used to anoint Israel's rightful kings. The matter cannot be definitively established, however, because the balsam tree has been extinct for some 1,500 years. I was wondering why I'd never really heard of a balsam tree. If the oil is indeed balsam oil, it may well be part of the treasure stipulated in the copper scroll. In any case, it is an incongruously costly commodity to have been used by a community of supposedly isolated ascetics in the desert. As we have noted, however, one of the most important features of the copper scroll is that it shows Qumran not to have been so isolated after all. On the contrary, it would seem to establish links between the Qumran community and factions associated with the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so I guess this chapter is just kind of a catalog of kind of the important finds that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls and I think probably most of what we're going to find are sectarian material, stuff that they wrote that's specific to their sect, the rules and regulations, the titles and rituals. And then there are also some commentaries on the Old Testament. I believe there's an important commentary on the book of Habakkuk, prophecies of Habakkuk. But this one here is called the Community Rule. Found in Cave 1 at Qumran, the Community Rule, as we have seen, adumbrates the rituals and regulations governing life in the desert community. It establishes a hierarchy of authority for the community. It lays down instructions for the master of the community and for the various officers subordinate to him. It also specifies the principles of behavior and the punishment for violation of these principles. Thus, for instance, whoever has deliberately lied shall do penance for 6 months. The text opens by enunciating the basis on which the community define and distinguish themselves. All members must enter into a covenant before God to obey all his commandments. And he who practices such obedience will be cleansed from all his sins. Adherence to the law is accorded a paramount position. Among the various terms by which the community's members are designated, one finds keepers of the covenant and those who have zeal for the law. Among the rituals stipulated, there is cleansing and purification by baptism, and that's very unique. Purification by baptism, not just once, but apparently every day. And also, obviously, a link to the early Christians, or at least John the Baptist. Daily prayers are also specified at dawn and at sunset, involving recitations of the law. And there is a ritually purified meal of the congregation, a meal very similar, as other scrolls attest, to the Last Supper of the so-called early church. The community rule speaks, too, of the council of the community, made up of 12 men and possibly a further 3 priests, possibly. We have already discussed the interesting echoes of the cornerstone or keystone image in relation to the council of the community, but the scroll also states that the council shall preserve the faith in the land with steadfastness and meekness, and shall atone for sin by the practice of justice and by suffering the sorrows of affliction. In their eagerness to distance the Qumran community from Jesus and his entourage, scholars promoting the consensus of the international team stress that the concept of atonement does not figure in the Qumran teachings, that Jesus is to be distinguished from Qumran's teacher of righteousness in large part by virtue of his doctrine of atonement. The community rule, however, demonstrates that atonement figured as prominently in Qumran as it did with Jesus and his followers in the so-called early church. Finally, the community rule introduces the Messiah, or perhaps messiahs in the plural. Members of the community walking in the way of perfection are obliged to adhere zealously to the law until there shall come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. This reference is usually interpreted as meaning 2 distinct messiahs, 2 equally regal figures, one descended from the line of Aaron, one from the established line of Israel, therefore the line of David and Solomon. But the reference may also be to a dynasty of single messiahs, descended from and uniting both lines. In the context of the time, of course, Messiah does not signify what it later comes to signify in tradition, in Christian tradition. It simply means the anointed one, which denotes consecration by oil. In Israelite tradition, it would seem both kings and priests, in fact, any claimant to high office, were anointed and hence messiahs. Okay, this is the War Scroll. Copies of the War Scroll were found in caves 1 and 4 at Qumran. On one level, the War Scroll is a very specific manual of strategy and tactics, obviously intended for specific circumstances at a specific place and time. Thus, for example, 7 troops of horsemen shall also station themselves to right and left of the formation. The troops shall stand on this side. On another level, however, the text constitutes exhortation and prophetic propaganda intended to galvanize morale against the invading foe, the Kittim or Romans. The supreme leader of Israel against the Kittim is called, quite unequivocally, the Messiah, though certain commentators have sought to disguise or dissemble this nomenclature by referring to him as thine anointed. The advent of the Messiah is stated as having been prophesied in Numbers 24:17, where it is said that a star from Jacob takes the leadership, a scepter arises from Israel. The star thus becomes a sobriquet for the Messiah, the regal warrior priest king who will lead the forces of Israel to triumph. As Robert Eisenman has stressed, this prophecy linking the Messiah figure with the image of the star occurs elsewhere in the Qumran literature and is of crucial importance. It is also significant that the same prophecy is cited by sources quite independent of both Qumran and the New Testament, by historians and chroniclers of first century Rome, for example, such as Josephus, Tacitus, and Suetonius, and Simeon bar Kokhba, instigator of the second revolt against the Romans between AD 132 and 35, called himself the son of the star. And there's also that can't remember his name, Zakkai, Ben Zakkai, who was the early progenitor of rabbinic Judaism, also uses the star prophecy. The War Scroll imparts a metaphysical and theological dimension to the struggle against the Kittim by depicting it as a clash between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. More importantly still, however, the scroll contains a vital clue to its own dating and chronology. When speaking of the Kittim, the text refers quite explicitly to their king. The Kittim concerned cannot therefore be the soldiers of Republican Rome, who invaded Palestine in 63 BC and who had no monarch. On the contrary, they would have to be the soldiers of Imperial Rome, who invaded in the wake of the revolt of 66 AD. Although, of course, occupying troops had been present in Palestine since the imposition of Imperial Roman prefects or procurators in AD 6. It is thus clear that the War Scroll must be seen in the context not of pre-Christian times, but of the first century. As we shall see, this internal evidence of chronology, which advocates of the consensus which advocates of the consensus contrive to ignore, will be even more persuasively developed in one of the other and most crucial of the Qumran texts, which is what I was just talking about, the commentary on Habakkuk. But for now, we're going to look into the Temple Scroll. The Temple Scroll is believed to have been found in Cave 11 at Qumran, though this has never been definitively established. As its name suggests, the scroll deals at least in part with the Temple of Jerusalem, with the design, furnishing, fixtures, and fittings of the structure. It also outlines specific details of rituals practiced in the temple. At the same time, however, the name conferred on the scroll by Yigael Yadin is somewhat misleading. In effect, the temple scroll is a species of Torah, or a book of the law, a kind of alternative Torah, used by the Qumran community and other factions elsewhere in Palestine. The official Torah of Judaism comprises the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are deemed to be the books of laws which Moses received on Mount Sinai, and their authorship is traditionally ascribed to Moses himself. The temple scroll constitutes, in a sense, a 6th book of the law. The laws it contains are not confined to rites of worship and observance in the temple. There are also laws pertaining to more general matters, such as ritual purification, marriage, and sexual practices. Most important and interesting of all, there are laws governing the institution of kingship in Israel, the character, comportment, behavior, and obligations of the king. The king, for example, is strictly forbidden to be a foreigner. He is forbidden to have more than one wife. And like all other Jews, he is forbidden to marry his sister, his aunt, his brother, his wife, or his niece. There is nothing new or startling about most of these taboos. They can be found in Leviticus 18-20 in the Old Testament. But one of them, that forbidding the king's marriage to his niece, is new. It is found elsewhere in only one other place. Another of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus document. As Eisenman has pointed out, this stricture provides an important clue to the dating of both the Temple Scroll and the Damascus document, and by extension, of course, to the other Dead Sea Scrolls as well. As we have noted, the consensus of the international team regards the Dead Sea Scrolls as pre-Christian, dating from the era of Israel's Maccabean kings, 1st and 2nd century BC. But there is no evidence that the Maccabean kings or any Israelite kings before them ever married their nieces or ever incurred criticism for doing so. The issue seems to have been utterly irrelevant. Either marriage to one's niece was accepted or it was never practiced at all. In either case, it was not forbidden. The situation changed dramatically, however, with the accession of Herod and his descendants. In the first place, Herod was, by Judaic standards, at the time, a foreigner of Arabian stock from Idumea, a region to the south of Judea. In the second place, the Herodian kings made a regular practice of marrying their nieces, and Herodian princesses regularly married their uncles. Bernice, sister of King Agrippa, AD 48-53, married her uncle, for example. Herodias, sister of Agrippa the First, 37-44 AD, went even further, marrying 2 uncles in succession. The strictures in the Temple Scroll are thus of particular relevance to a very specific period and constitute a direct criticism of the Herodian dynasty, a dynasty of foreign puppet kings imposed on Israel forcibly and sustained in power by imperial Rome. Taken in sum, the evidence of the Temple Scroll runs counter to the consensus of the international team in 3 salient respects. 1, according to the consensus, the Qumran community had no connection with or interest in either the temple or the official Judaism of the time. Like the Copper Scroll, however, the Temple Scroll establishes that the Qumran community were indeed preoccupied with temple affairs and with the governing theocracy. 2, according to the consensus, the supposed Essenes of Qumran were on cordial terms with Herod. The Temple Scroll, however, goes out of its way to include certain specific strictures intended to damn Herod and his dynasty. These strictures would be meaningless in any other context. According to the consensus, 3. According to the consensus, the temple scroll itself, like all other Qumran texts, dates from pre-Christian times. Yet the internal evidence of the scroll points to issues that would have become relevant only during the Herodian period, that is, during the 1st century of the Christian era. Okay, this section is on the Damascus document. The Damascus document was known to the world long before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. In the absence of a context, however, scholars were not sure what to make of it. Towards the end of the last century, the loft of an ancient synagogue in Cairo was found to contain a geniza, a depository for disposal of worn-out or redundant religious texts dating from the 9th century AD. In 1896, 50 years before the scrolls were discovered, almost, a few fragments from this geniza were confided to one Solomon Schechter, a lecturer at Cambridge University who happened to be in Cairo at the time. One fragment proved to contain the original Hebrew version of a text which for 1,000 years had been known only in secondary translations. This prompted Schechter to investigate further. In December 1896, he collected the entire contents of the geniza, 164 boxes of manuscripts housing some 100,000 pieces, and brought them back to Cambridge. From this welter of material, 2 Hebrew versions emerged of what came to be known as the Damascus document. The versions from the Cairo geniza were obviously later copies of a much earlier work. The texts were incomplete, lacking endings and probably large sections in the middle. The order of the text was scrambled and the logical development of their themes confused. Even in this muddled form, however, the Damascus document was provocative, potentially explosive. Schechter published it for the first time in 1910. In 1913, R.H. Charles reprinted it in his compilation, The Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. Okay, we're going to stop right there for today, and we'll take over, learn more about the Damascus document when we come back tomorrow. Hope to see you there. Thanks for tuning in today.